Hey, this is Steve Kwan. Welcome to another episode of Fighting Matters. This is going to be an interesting one. I'm here with my boy Jeff Shaw from Bellingham, BJJ. How's it going, Jeff?
Doing great, Steve. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk about this stuff today.
I like how you say thanks for having me on, like you're just some schmucky guest rather than one of the recurring hosts here.
Yeah, you know, I always like to actualize my inner schmuck, which is a great word.
As you should.
But yeah, no, I'm excited to talk to you about this stuff. Like, I'm a huge jiu-jitsu history dork, and so being able to talk about this stuff with folks that understand really excites me. And so I hope some of the folks that are tuning in are as into this stuff as I am.
Awesome. Well, let's set the table here before we get into this. We've got a really interesting jiu-jitsu historical concept here to unpack today. Normally on this show, we talk about things more relevant to current events, but we're going to go back in the time machine here and talk about some of the untold history of jiu-jitsu. Now, maybe we should introduce the topic, but first, Jeff, we should probably make it clear to the audience that you're not just some jiu-jitsu podcast guy. You're not just a jiu-jitsu professor. You are also an actual real professor as well. So why don't we set the table, talk about the work that you've been doing, and maybe introduce the topic here that we wanted to share with people.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm one of these lucky people that has turned my passion into my job. And so I teach at Western Washington University in beautiful Bellingham, Washington. And I teach in the journalism department and the environmental studies department. But my research interest, my academic research interest, is the history of jiu-jitsu. And I define jiu-jitsu broadly. We'll get into that in a minute. But because my field is journalism, I look at this through a lens of the way the media reported on jiu-jitsu. This is really useful, I think, for a couple of reasons. You always want to get as close to accurate reality as you possibly can, and human beings all have motivations. But if you look at how the press was covering things at the time, nobody gets everything right, but it gives you a broad perspective about how people at a ton of different newspapers saw this new thing. And I think it's really fascinating in talking about jiu-jitsu and also judo, which came around the same time. And we'll talk about how those two got confused and the similarities and the differences. But it also shows you how culture gets transmitted and how art gets transmitted. And how at first the reporters are doing their best job trying to understand this thing that's arcane and strange, and they get some stuff right and they get some stuff wrong. But especially during the period that I particularly research, it's really interesting to see their understanding of jiu-jitsu, judo, the Japanese martial arts, the fighting arts more broadly, expand, and what they think. And just as a teaser, I will say, although this is historical, the more I did research with this, the more I realized that what happened from 1900 to 1906 has echoes today and has a lot of lessons for the way that we work on our martial arts and work on policy in the modern era as well.
Amazing, man. Well, let's unpack that. I mean, you kind of set the stage with the time zone that we're talking about here today. Tell us a bit about your research, who you're looking into, what the time period is. And let's dig into that, because I personally have not, you've told me what you've been looking into, but I don't know the specifics. So I am going to learn just as much out of this conversation as the listeners will. So maybe what is the time period and who are kind of the main historical figures that you've been researching?
So the time period that I'm focusing on is between 1900 to 1906 in America, and I'm interested in all the other stuff too. I got interested in this primarily because as a jiu-jitsu guy, I was super fascinated by how jiu-jitsu was developed, how jiu-jitsu was transmitted from culture to culture. And once I started researching that, a lot of folks that are doing great historical research on the other parts of it, Jose Tufi Kairos to name one, Robert Drysdale to name another, do a lot of great work with what we call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and what some folks call Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And all of that stuff is amazing. I learn a lot from those guys. And of course, I'm interested in that too and know a fair bit about the history of what we call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But what fascinated me was when Jiu-Jitsu first came from Japan to America in 1900 with a guy named John O'Brien, when Judo followed a few months later with Yoshiaki Yamashita, Sunejiro Tomita, and a bunch of other folks. And for me, the first wave of jiu-jitsu instruction begins from 1900 and ends at about 1906 when Yamashita leaves America to go back to Japan. And this is the stuff that sort of sets the stage for what we call Brazilian jiu-jitsu. The people that I'm studying primarily involve the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, who we're going to talk a lot about today, John O'Brien, the first jiu-jitsu instructor in America, all of the Kodokan judoka who came, the Yamashitas, Yoshiaki Yamashita and his wife Fude, who were critically important important. But in addition to those figures, we study some folks that are minor figures in this story, but then become major figures in broader stories, like Mitsuyo Maeda, who people know as Count Koma, who people know as the man who taught the Gracies, which is, this sort of received tradition, and the accuracy of that is debated among scholars. But none of that stuff, none of it would have happened without President Theodore Roosevelt starting to train jiu-jitsu with John O'Brien in 1902. And that's my main thing.
So hold on, controversial statement. Are you saying that jiu-jitsu was not invented by Helio Gracie when he discovered leverage? Or are you saying that that was not the beginning of jiu-jitsu history, Jeff?
So I'm going to say three things. The first thing is I want us to not get caught up in terminology. I have a video for this on my YouTube channel and my TikTok channel about how if you look at the media reports, almost all of the Japanese martial arts are referred to as, in the media reports at the time from 1900 to 1906, almost all of the media reports say jiu-jitsu. There's only a few references to judo, even though the Kodokan folks were obviously teaching judo. And this is partially because people didn't really know what they were seeing. And so they referred to it by the first thing they heard, which is, well, this guy O'Brien was teaching jujitsu, a transliteration of the Japanese term jujutsu. And so they just kind of called it that. My thing is with martial arts are composed of two things, in my view, techniques and philosophy. The technique is what the martial art does. The philosophy is what the martial arts is for. And for me, that's the biggest difference between jiu-jitsu and judo. And it certainly was in Jigoro Kano's mind as well, is like, what is this martial art for? And so if you hear, we as martial artists get super into the idea of lineage, of Maeda taught the Gracies, and the Gracies taught these people, and these people, and we can discuss the merit of that. But I want us to not necessarily think about that so much, so sort of dogmatically, and think instead, my second main point, that learning appears in and occurs in a lot of different ways. I have learned at least as much from my training partners as I have from every instructor I've ever had. I've learned a ton from my instructors, and I'm grateful to all of them. But if you just think of the math, you learn as much from the people around you, just by a matter of simple time on the mat with them. And that was true of the people around this time as well. And so when people debate about things like, well, was Maeda teaching judo or was he teaching jujitsu? I think we should kind of relax about that, which isn't necessarily what you asked. But like the third thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is that simple stories are boring. If the story is simply Steve taught Jeff a thing, Jeff taught his students a thing, okay, great. The story is now over. I think the history of martial arts and history of jiu-jitsu, judo, however we define those terms, is much more fascinating, nuanced, complex, rich, and interesting than a simple thing like X taught Y, Y taught Z. And I said Z because you're Canadian.
We get this sometimes in the comments, right? Because, on Fighting Matters, we do a lot of discussion about the far right and its impact on sports like jiu-jitsu. And a comment that we've received many times is, this isn't new. This has been the way it has been since day one. But that mentality kind of assumes that you buy into the mythos that jiu-jitsu basically started with the Gracies, right? And if you agree with that, then yes, I think it is fair to say that jiu-jitsu has had a far-right bent since day one. But if you understand the history of jiu-jitsu and its roots in judo and Japanese jiu-jitsu, and you look at, Jigoro Kano, very different philosophies from what, the OG Gracies would have espoused. And the Gracies have done a very good job of kind of distinguishing and delineating their own brand of jiu-jitsu as being different from what was done in the past, even though, it's very debatable as to whether that is actually the case. But however, modern popularity of jiu-jitsu stems from the UFC and it stems from their marketing. So to many people, they look at Brazilian jiu-jitsu and the work of the Gracies and Mitsuyo Maeda as the beginning of this journey, whereas really that was just one modern step in terms of where we've come from. And so I really like this topic that you've got, because you're kind of turning the clock back even further and talking about what jiu-jitsu was like before it became this thing that became so associated with the Gracie family. I'm old enough in my training to remember there was a time when it was very important to call jiu-jitsu Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or BJJ, simply because it was not yet so popular that people understood the difference, right? I mean, you had to say, I train Brazilian jiu-jitsu, because there was always the chance that if you just rolled into a random jiu-jitsu gym, it might be some Japanese jiu-jitsu gym and you wouldn't be getting what you expected. Whereas now there's kind of been a counter movement to say, like, let's just call it jiu-jitsu. We don't need to say Brazilian anymore, because BJJ has gotten so far ahead of the other variants of jiu-jitsu that you can kind of assume when people talk about jiu-jitsu today, they're talking about like Gracie-derived UFC-style jiu-jitsu as opposed to Japanese jiu-jitsu. But I will leave it to you maybe to kind of expand on this period of history, this pre-Gracie period of history. And I specifically want to hear what Teddy Roosevelt's involvement was in the sport, because that probably will surprise a lot of people.
Totally. And let me start out with one paragraph of the prehistory before jiu-jitsu came to America, which is Japanese jiu-jitsu comprised a variety of forms developed over hundreds of years with many, many different styles. Kano himself studied 2 different styles of jiu-jitsu that we know about. And some of these had weapons defenses, some of them didn't. They were all mostly self-defense and fighting focused. Few of them had sportive applications, but the techniques varied widely. And so we can talk about the genius of Jigoro Kano another time, but what he did was he systematized it, he created a robust curriculum, and he had a statement of purpose where this is what the art is for. I always say there is not jujitsu anymore. There are jujitsus, and the way that people talk about jujitsu, whether that's Brazilian jiu-jitsu or Japanese jiu-jitsu or what have you, that says more about them and their rhetorical goals than it does about the aspects of what we're actually training. And this is why there's a movement that tries to make Gracie Jiu-Jitsu different from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Some folks just say Jiu-Jitsu, which I think is defensible. And some folks make a difference between sport Jiu-Jitsu and self-defense Jiu-Jitsu. For me, terminology, words mean what we choose them to mean. And I think these distinctions are not necessarily useful anymore. But to come back to the origins of jiu-jitsu in America. So even if you're not as old as I am, you probably remember a time when there were fake black belts everywhere, where people would claim to have trained a thing that they just hadn't. And this was the era of the dojo storm. I'm here to tell you that those folks were always around, especially when there was money to be made, and especially when very few people knew the art that they were claiming to know. And so it's interesting to read back on the media reports and see who you think was legit and who you think wasn't. Now, indisputably, the first jiu-jitsu instructor in America was pretty legit. His name was John O'Brien. He had learned traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu as a police constable in Nagasaki, Japan, where he was for 4 or 5 years. He returned to the United States in 1900 with his instructor, a guy named Inoue, and they did some demonstrations over the period of a year or so. And you see him get a little bit of media coverage. O'Brien clearly wanted to make a living teaching and training jiu-jitsu in America, and he was able to do that, but it was slow going at first. There are still some media reports from 1900 and 1901, although fewer than about 10 stories every year, about him and Inoue going and giving demonstrations or doing challenge matches. And we even have some pictures that can kind of see what the techniques he was using are. And again, I'll get into that technique versus philosophy distinction later on. But it's clearly a guy who loves jiu-jitsu, clearly a guy who wants to make it his life, and clearly a guy who's kind of struggling. He gets a good gig in 1901 when the Evening World, a newspaper in New York, lets him write a jiu-jitsu instruction column. And there are these beautiful illustrations. He's using jiu-jitsu from a self-defense perspective, teaching women how to stop getting their purses snatched, teaching men how to stop things like the two-hand choke or the bully choke. And he writes this column for the Evening World. But again, there's not much media coverage. There's not really much of there's not a zeitgeist. There's not it doesn't take off. And people who want to see more about this can follow me on some of the social channels where I make videos about this. We'll talk about that at the end. But people are often surprised to learn that this may not be the era we're living in now may not be the most popular era for jiu-jitsu. That might have been 1900 to 1906. Because in 1902, Roosevelt takes some lessons from O'Brien. And the media coverage that O'Brien wanted suddenly starts to happen. Instead of fewer than 10 stories a year, you see hundreds of stories in a year, peaking in 1905 when, imagine, 1,500 mainstream newspaper stories about jiu-jitsu occurring in America. Even today, with tons of newspapers, that wouldn't happen, but it happened in 1905. And that was sort of the effect that Roosevelt had. So to talk about Roosevelt himself, if you're listening to this and you probably know a little bit, at least about Theodore Roosevelt, we can get as in-depth as you want. But Roosevelt was famous for advocating what he called the strenuous life, an athletic, challenging, a man in the arena sort of pursuit. And he loved sport, loved all sports, and particularly combat sports. He boxed, he wrestled. In fact, scholars, like one of my colleagues, a scholar named Ryan Swanson, has made the case that Roosevelt started a new era of American athleticism, and that sport in America as we know it today is basically due to Theodore Roosevelt. During his presidency, we saw the first World Baseball Series in America. During his presidency, the NCAA was created. During his presidency, we hosted the Olympics for the first time in America. Roosevelt really, really believed in sport. And he had an affinity for Asian cultures, and which is kind of an interesting, complex, and multifaceted relationship. But when he got the opportunity to learn jiu-jitsu, he brought O'Brien to the White House, and he took a series of lessons with him. He called those lessons marvelous, although he said that the system was hard for him to learn. And shortly thereafter, a series of wonderful media illustrations with political cartoons of Roosevelt in a gi training jiu-jitsu, or Roosevelt doing a wrist lock on his boxing instructor, or Roosevelt as a metaphor, and we'll get into the metaphor thing in a bit. As jiu-jitsu becomes more and more popular and people become more socialized and understanding what it is, you start to see jiu-jitsu used as a metaphor for other things. So Roosevelt, when he busted trusts and monopolies, he was portrayed as using jiu-jitsu to sort of twist the arms of these people that were abusing consumers. And that tells you two things. For one thing, it tells you how popular jiu-jitsu was. And second, it tells you that newspaper editors and writers and illustrators assumed the public understood what jiu-jitsu is. Now imagine that today. Imagine having to and a lot of these things appeared on the front page of newspapers, so it was big news. Imagine the New York Times running a story about jiu-jitsu without having to explain what it is.
Unfortunately, there was a time recently when the New York Times did run a story about jiu-jitsu, and it was not a good news story, right? This is the challenge that we face today. Most of the time when jiu-jitsu makes it into the news, it's because some instructor committed a crime somewhere. So it's interesting to think of a time when jiu-jitsu kind of captured the public sentiment because the president was into it and was behind it, right? I mean, I guess the closest parallel I can even think of is, recently there was a very small scale story about how Ivanka Trump's kids train jiu-jitsu and she's like a blue belt or something, barely made a blip, right? I mean, it kind of circulated on a few jiu-jitsu news sites, but really nobody cared. But the idea of like a president actually going all in and promoting the martial arts, it really is the closest thing I can think of to a modern parallel is probably, for all of the criticisms that I know you and I have of him aside, the impact that Joe Rogan had on Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I mean, we have spoken very critically about some of his actions, but the reality is a big part of the modern success of jiu-jitsu is because of his relentless promotion of jiu-jitsu and getting it in front of so many people. And he's just, a podcaster, commentator, comedian guy. If a president got behind jiu-jitsu, I can only imagine, like you said, thousands of news stories about the sport. It raises interesting ideas of what could become of the sport if it kind of achieved that level of profile.
So this is because you used the word sport, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Roosevelt and his role in the martial arts, because to Roosevelt, and part of why I think martial arts people love him is they see him correctly as one of us. And they also, because he wasn't just a jiu-jitsu guy, he wasn't just a judo guy, he was a wrestler, he was a boxer. He would spar with random visitors to the White House. And this was
you could dojo storm the White House back in his day? That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll tell one story about that in a second, but like imagine sparring with the President of the United States, and that's a thing that could actually happen at that time. And I'll just tell the story. In 1904, Robert Johnstone Mooney, whose brother was a high-level amateur boxer, had an appointment, just a tourist appointment at the White House. And Roosevelt was like, "Oh, I know your brother. He's a boxer. Do you guys want to box?" And they're like, Yes, sir, Mr. Roosevelt, sir. So they lace up the gloves, they box with him. Roosevelt has the brother teach him a little bit like, hey, how'd you hit this guy? And he showed him this combination. And at the end of the meeting, he asks the Mooney brothers, hey, do you guys know jujitsu? And they didn't. And he starts doing jujitsu on them and like sparring jujitsu with them in the same way that you'd show a white belt and then like, you want to see how this works? And they were impressed with his skills. I'm a little sus on that, but like, obviously you're not gonna try and break the president's arm. But they'd never seen jujitsu before. And Roosevelt tells them, you have to learn jujitsu immediately because with the athletic ability you have with your other athletic skills, including boxing, you'll do great at this. But Steve, one other thing, and this is a distinction in the jiu-jitsu community today, and I think the sport versus self-defense debate is largely artificial. I think it's contrived. We can discuss that. But you said the sport. At this time, it wasn't really considered a sport. Almost all of it was considered, during the first few years of jiu-jitsu in America was, hey, this is for self-defense. And it was portrayed as a deadly fighting martial art that was a little arcane and we don't really understand it. But the real, for me, the reason we have public martial arts as sports in America goes back to President Roosevelt. And it goes back to a sports writer named Robert Edgren, who was also an illustrator. He did one of those illustrations of the president wrist locking his boxing instructor. And at the time, you didn't really have a jiu-jitsu league, right? You had, baseball was in its infancy in America. The World Series was just starting to happen. But so after Roosevelt starts training jiu-jitsu, and after some people begin taking challenge matches, like a guy named Katsugumi Higashi, who was the first jiu-jitsu star in America, suddenly Edgren starts using the president's role in jiu-jitsu and Higashi's prominence to start promoting mixed style matches between Higashi and catch wrestlers, between Higashi and boxers. He starts sort of like trying to set up fights between Higashi and guys like Jim Jeffries, who was the heavyweight champion of the world at the time. And the very notion that martial arts could be sport and could be popular entertainment really in America starts in the Roosevelt era.
Interesting, interesting. I mean, it makes you think. There's some parallel universe out there where this was the moment where jujitsu became like the thing in the States. Because in America, I mean, no one had even heard of this until the 90s. And then it wasn't even until really the 2000s where jujitsu really started to take off. And even today, we live in a jujitsu bubble, right? We feel like this is this big, gigantic sport and it's getting there, but it's still a drop in the bucket, right? But there's some parallel universe in there where this was the beginning of the jiu-jitsu movement. And it makes you wonder if we had kind of like the UFC type stuff happening back in Teddy Roosevelt's era instead of in the 1990s. I mean, the sport would have developed and changed so much. What would America look like now from a martial arts perspective if that was the predominant moment when fight sports blew up and became a big thing and became and stayed part of the public consciousness? I wonder how much things would have changed. Because I mean, you and I have talked about this before. Being older guys, we grew up and most of our understanding of the martial arts was, like Hollywood films and Bruce Lee. So our understanding was kind of this romanticized filmic version of kung fu and karate. Whereas I wonder if this had really stuck, where America became a very jujitsu centric, combat sports centric country back in the early 1900s, what would life look like today? Right? I imagine instead of having like the NHL and the NBA dominating ratings and capturing so much of the youth demo when it comes to who watches this stuff, can you imagine if that was fight sports instead? It would be fantastic.
You know what's wild, Steve? It almost happened. And it only happened because Americans made one bad decision. And that's where the lessons for me come in through today. And folks, if you're listening to this and you don't know this story, the story of how Yamashita came to leave America, if you pay attention to nothing else we say for the rest of this hour, although I hope you will, please, this is the most important thing that I'm going to tell you. So Roosevelt took some lessons from O'Brien, and O'Brien had studied jiu-jitsu for 4 or 5 years. Looking back on, like, from my analysis, I would put him at about a blue belt, which is, you can learn a lot from a good blue belt, especially if there's nobody else around that knows jiu-jitsu. And so Roosevelt takes some lessons, is like, hey, this is great, really enjoy it. He stops taking lessons because he's the president and has to do other stuff. And in 1904, Yoshiaki Yamashita, who's one of the greatest Kodokan judoka of all time, comes to America. He's brought by the Seattle businessman Sam Hill to start teaching his son. That doesn't really wind up happening, but folks know that Roosevelt is really into the Japanese martial arts. Yamashita ends up, and his wife Fude end up going to the White House, and immediately, and the difference in coverage is striking, because when Roosevelt sees the demonstration that the Yamashitas put on, instantly, and this is a direct quote from the newspapers of the time, he sees what jujitsu really is. And so imagine you see a blue belt and you're like, man, that's super badass. And then you see a legendary black belt. And that's what it was like seeing Yamashita. The Kodokan folks were just head and shoulders above everybody else in America at that time. And so both Yamashitas begin teaching jiu-jitsu in Washington, D.C. They teach them to the elite, not just men, but women as well. The president's daughter, Alice Roosevelt, takes classes from Yamashita. Fude Yamashita puts on the first women-only judo class in America at the time. So the next time anybody gives you shit about having a women's only class, it's an American tradition that's more than a century old. And she does public demonstrations against men and throws them. It's a fascinating and exciting time to be in the martial arts. And Roosevelt immediately sees the value in what these folks do. So not only does he employ Yamashita himself, he sets him up to teach our servicemen at the U.S. military academies. So he gets him a job at Annapolis, teaching at the U.S. Naval Academy. And he gets him a salary. And so to your point, this is the alternative universe that we're talking about. It's happening. Like, America is getting judo. Before I finish this story, I just want to say, because I know people who are listening love the martial arts. When I say jujitsu, like I said, the media at the time basically lumped together jujitsu and judo. We know that O'Brien did not train at the Kodokan, so he was only showing jujitsu. We know that Yamashita was a Kodokan representative explicitly showing judo, even though it wasn't referred to that in press reports at the time. But people saw what Yamashita was doing, and they called it judo, with a very few exceptions. So I just want to point that out, that Roosevelt was studying both jujitsu and judo. So here's the problem. And here's why this doesn't wind up happening. And for me, this is such an insane thought experiment to think about how this went a different way. Unfortunately, there was a lot of racism and nativism in America at the time, then as now. And so some folks, mostly wrestlers, were uncomfortable with someone teaching the Japanese martial arts at an American military academy. And why don't we teach good old American wrestling instead? So they start a movement to sort of make that happen. And that sort of like xenophobia ends up leading to a series of bad press for jiu-jitsu, a movement to like not renew Yamashita's contract. To Roosevelt's credit, Roosevelt stands firm, and he's like, no way, this stuff is amazing. He writes a letter to the Secretary of the Navy saying, look, this is incredible, we got to keep this. But eventually, this grassroots movement gains power, and the argument that they use is, hey, Yamashita makes $5,000 a year. You imagine our tax dollars going to fund this guy to teach this judo to Americans? We should be using that to teach American wrestling. This was the Doge of its day, because if you were to tell me we could invest $5,000 and get this guy to stay and create a crop of American black belts in 1906, in the seat of power in America, with all of the most educated, most well-resourced, richest, physically the best athletes in America, he's teaching this in the center of power. If you were to tell me that's going to cost us $5,000, that's an insanely good investment. So Yamashita leaves America in 1906. Imagine if he stays even another 5 years, creates, let's just say, 20 black belts. There are 20 Kodokan judo black belts in America in like 1911. One, how different does the American martial arts landscape look, especially because there was a growing martial arts culture at the time. Second, once, some of y'all know this history, and if not, I'll tell you. Part of why Jigoro Kano wanted to create judo is that he thought jiu-jitsu guys were shady, thought that they were fighters. He disapproved of professional fighting, disapproved of like these challenge matches, these martial arts for public performance for money. But a lot of his guys, like Maeda, wanted to be professional fighters. They wanted to make a living doing martial arts and doing this thing that they were incredibly skilled at. But they couldn't do that as representatives of the Kodokan. And so part of why, and some scholars, I think we're learning a lot about Maeda, because some people think this was Maeda's plan all along. But basically, when Yamashita leaves America, suddenly you have Mitsuyo Maeda in America, and there are no other Kodokan representatives there, and he has a choice to make. And he chooses to go barnstorming through South America, ends up in Brazil, where he ends up teaching the Gracies. If we don't remove Yamashita from the U.S. Naval Academy, does Maeda ever go to Brazil? I mean, maybe. It might have been inevitable. Maybe that was his plan all along. Maybe that happens no matter what in every universe. Or maybe he stays in America, because we know he opened a school in New York in 1906. And then suddenly, with the sudden like fizzling out of the jiu-jitsu craze and Yamashita leaving, Maeda left as well. But imagine, in that scenario, Brazilian jiu-jitsu doesn't happen.
Something that you're making me think of here. You and I on Fighting Matters here have pushed back many times against this idea that you hear in jiu-jitsu quite often about how like keep politics out of jiu-jitsu, right? We should never have politics in jiu-jitsu. Sounds great to say, but it's a lot harder to unpack when you actually think about the implications. And what you're revealing to me here is that jiu-jitsu has always been political, right? The examples that you're bringing up are situations where the world of politics specifically shaped the jiu-jitsu that we know and love today. And so to say jiu-jitsu shouldn't be political is kind of disingenuous, because in a lot of ways it's been more political than anything, than anything else. The politics have shaped what we know today. Is that a fair assessment, or am I misunderstanding here?
No, not only is that a fair assessment, I would go a step beyond. Everything is political. The way you live your life is political. And if we want to build a world where it's not just about who can dominate who and who can bully who, then that's politics, right? Like we have a word for how people settle disputes of violence. We call it war. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about jiu-jitsu is it takes these human impulses and it funnels them into positive outlets for learning. And I think that is what Jigoro Kano was trying to do as well, because he was trying to combat fascism in his native Japan, right? Part of what he wanted to do, toward the end of his life, was bring the Olympics to Tokyo to keep Japan out of the war and to try to prevent World War II from happening, essentially. And that's just one example. And I think that people hear politics and they think, well, I don't like politics, and I understand. People want to live their lives in a way that people want to pursue their passions, right? You don't want to be thinking about, I need to do a research project on the impact of tariffs, unless that's your passion. You don't think, I want to do a research project about fairness with gender in sport. But I think the world, regardless of what how you label your own personal politics, everybody should be concerned with the impact that their life has on other people. And that's my politics. And I think of that as values more than I do politics. And so thinking about the way that our actions benefit people, particularly the people that need that benefit the most, that's what's really important to me. And so yeah, the way we choose to, because jiu-jitsu involves people, and people are political. Jiu-jitsu involves power. Power is political. Jiu-jitsu involves economics. The way you make a living is political. And the question is not whether we do politics or not. Those who don't do politics get done in by politics. And so for me, I think it's better to just make it explicit and to sort of explore that, hey, these are our values. This is what I'm doing is going to benefit the world or not, right? And that's certainly, to take it back to Roosevelt's idea. There's a reason that everybody and if you look at Roosevelt's life, and not just the jiu-jitsu parts, but if you look at Roosevelt's politics, by and large, you see him, and no human being is perfect. I don't worship politicians. I definitely don't worship presidents. But you look at Roosevelt busting monopolies that were abusing consumers. You look at Roosevelt talking about, and there's a reason that the man in the arena speech is in most jiu-jitsu academies in America, right? Because Roosevelt truly believed in the power of the average person, that the credit belongs to the people that actually do the work, whose faces are marred by sweat and blood. And I think that if you're doing jujitsu today, you could do worse than that example, right? He was also a man who believed in learning from other nations and cultures, which you know, we could do well with today as well.
I mean, for me personally, the challenge in my jujitsu journey has been that the deeper I get into this, the more I realize that much of what constitutes this sport and this art that I've really built a lot of my life around, I just kind of have fundamental disagreements with. I got into this because of the sport aspect of things, but as you get into the art aspect, as you mentioned, I've found so many places where I just don't really quite agree with what's being said or what's being done. You talked about how everything is political, right? I mean, from my experience, I've heard a lot of people make the argument that like you should never bring politics into the gym, environment, let everyone come in, don't even talk about it. And the problem that I have is when I hear that, if you peel back a layer or two, almost always that is being used as an excuse to allow really unsavory people into the gym, right? I mean, we've had people in our comments make that argument, and their specific goal is because they want to allow like white supremacists to train in the gym, because why should we discriminate against them? Well, the problem is if you're allowing people into your gym whose stated belief system is the suppression and removal of others, to allow them in is itself a political statement, right? If you are allowing those people into your gym, you are being just as, if not more political than the person who puts a pride flag up on the door. And so I think that often it is willful blindness to say, well, we don't talk about politics. Politics steer our entire lives, whether we want to or not. And if we act like they don't, then what happens is, as you said, we are giving the steering wheel to other people, and we may not like where they wind up taking us. I want to actually use this as an opportunity to pivot into something that you talked about earlier. You mentioned that actually one of the earliest and most iconic jiu-jitsu instructors in America was a woman. Now, we are in a sport right now where there is relentless propaganda about jiu-jitsu and MMA as a masculine endeavor, and a lot of pushback about even allowing women to take leadership roles in the sport. I mean, going through some of the comments, we've made episodes talking about the female experience in jiu-jitsu, and there's a lot of people in the comments who remember I've shared some with you. There were people who said like women are ruining the sport, just straight up saying like we got to get them out of here. And this all comes from this perspective that like jujitsu is this man's endeavor, and that it's our safe space as men, and that women are somehow polluting or corrupting it. But what you're telling me is actually this is the complete opposite of reality. Whereas at the beginning, if you trace this back, women have always been leaders in the sport, and we've just lost that part of history. Maybe expand a bit on that piece, because I think especially the women who listen to this would love to hear that.
Yeah, 100%. And like, here's the thing, that's not just true in America. That's true in places like England as well. It's true in places like Wales. Some of the earliest people that were transmitting jujitsu and having it transmitted to them were women. And as I mentioned, like, look, in America, we had our first women's only class before before 1906, right? And so you had Fude Yamashita, who was the wife of Yoshiaki Yamashita. This is another way Kano was very progressive, is that he encouraged women to learn judo. And I think that culture really applied. I'll talk about England in just a second, but another really interesting thing about women in jiu-jitsu in America in the early parts of the 20th century is it's everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean America's an incredibly large and geographically diverse country. And so although you did have women who were society women in places like Washington, New York, and Boston, you had the heiress Martha Blow Wadsworth, you had the philanthropist Isabella Stewart Gardner in Boston, who still has some jujitsu artifacts in her museum in Boston that you can go see. It wasn't just those folks. You had women who were working class women who were learning some jujitsu and forming self-defense clubs in places from Iowa to Washington State to Hawaii to all over. And one of the because you mentioned the sad backlash toward women in jiu-jitsu in the last few years, I want to provide a little bit of hope, and I want to provide a little bit of context. So one of the really interesting things about looking at coverage of jiu-jitsu in America from 1900 to 1906 is how progressive it is toward women who do jujitsu. And what I mean by that is there is none of this masculinization of women that you see today pointed towards women martial artists like Kayla Harrison. There's none of this, oh, she's a man, or any of that stuff. It's that women are basically being encouraged to do jujitsu. And part of this is there was a big problem in street harassment at the time. And there's a big problem in street harassment today. Back in the day,
I was
you
going
would
to say, I don't think much has changed, unfortunately.
no, all that's old is new again. But here's the great thing about this at that time, which is a bunch of women learned jujitsu and used it to beat the shit out of those men. And you see, not just like you see dozens of examples of media reports about this, about Japanese American women like Misao Soga. You see two or three people from San Francisco, people from Chicago, and these things get picked up in the media as, oh, hey, a woman used jujitsu to throw this guy and defend herself. Some of these end up in the courtroom. And what's interesting to me is there's almost no coverage from anybody that is critical of these women learning jujitsu to defend themselves. It's all sort of rah, yeah, you go get this guy. And I have some theories about why that is, which I'll get into in a minute. But like one of the things I'm looking into for a paper I'm presenting at a conference in Thailand in October is whether media coverage is more progressive in terms of women's issues in jiu-jitsu now than it was in 1906, and I don't actually think it is. You start to see, like, it's interesting even in papers that are so-called traditional values papers that say, hey, we believe in traditional gender roles. Even among those, you see things like, hey, we would like, it's strange, we don't like women doing combat sports necessarily. But on the other hand, these are strenuous times, using rhetoric from Roosevelt, and maybe a more strenuous woman is necessary, so maybe they should all do jujitsu. Nixila Greeley-Smith, who was a suffragist and the granddaughter of Horace Greeley, the guy who said, "Go West, young man," she was a suffragist who had a column, and she advocated, and she wasn't alone. There were many papers that advocated putting jujitsu in the public schools and specifically targeting women so that they would have the ability to defend themselves. It's really hard to actually find stories that are critical of women in jiu-jitsu at the time. Now that I've said this, I'm going to problematize this a little because I do think some of that is novelty. Like people were still just kind of understanding what it is. And second, we sort of think in narrative. And so it's easier. And what I mean by that is we think of things in terms of a story. If I tell you a story about a young Japanese woman who's 110 pounds and a guy tries to harass her on the street and she throws the shit out of him, and then he gets up and she throws the shit out of him again, you're probably going, yeah, right? I mean, that's a hell of a story arc, and a hell of an arc that he flew through the air when he hit the ground.
A hell of a trajectory.
Yeah, right. So if you follow me, you'll see pictures of this lady. So some of y'all may know this story, but this woman, Misao Soga, did this to a guy who was actually a professional boxer and a sparring partner of one of the prominent lightweights of the era. So this guy tries to harass her. She throws him. He gets up. She throws him again. And she ends up pressing charges, for which he's convicted. He's convicted of assaulting her and convicted in the press of getting the crap beaten out of him by a tiny woman. What's funny is because she's a recent immigrant, she doesn't have great English. And so the judge asks her to explain, hey, what did you do to this guy? And she can't really explain it in a way that the judge can understand it. And so the arresting officer says, why don't you show him? And so she throws the court interpreter twice. And you think it's funny now. There's an even funnier postscript. And so her poor interpreter is her uke, and there's a political cartoon of the time of her just absolutely drop sayonage-ing him, not once, but twice, which is kind of hilarious. So here's what's funny. So that's fun. Well, let me finish my point, and then I'll tell you the other reason it's funny. I think part of the reason that the coverage is so positive towards women in the first era is a lot of it is story based. And it's like, hey, everybody loves a good underdog story. When you start getting into, okay, but how do we create an environment that's welcoming to women? That's harder. People don't like hard things. People don't like complex things. And so they're like, just tell the story about when the girl beat the guy up again. And I'm susceptible as that too, because that's awesome. So here's what's funny. Who do you think, and this is a rhetorical question because you won't know, but who do you think suggested that she throw the courtroom interpreter? And I'll answer that. So I mentioned Katsugumi Higashi, who was the first competitive jiu-jitsu star in America at the time. Part of how he became competitively successful is he would give demonstrations at places around the country, including at police departments. So at the turn of the century in New York City, there was a competitive strongman who became a pretty famous New York City cop named Ajax Whitman. And this dude had incredible feats of strength. He was really famous at the time. He became like really popular once he became a cop because he was that cop that could just, manhandle you. And so Higashi goes to the New York City police and the police chief says, okay, fight Ajax. and he throws Ajax twice and chokes him unconscious until his tongue turns purple, right? And Ajax gets up, is a great sport about it. He's like, obviously, we should learn this. This is why jiu-jitsu ends up getting taught to at least a few police departments in America around the time. And so flash forward to the courtroom trial. Young lady's been harassed. This professional boxer tries to sexually harass her. She throws him. And when it becomes time to sort of describe, like, okay, how did you throw this guy? Okay, well, I can't really tell you. The person that suggested she throw somebody was the arresting officer. And if you guessed that the arresting officer was Ajax Whitman, you win 10,000 internet points. And so basically one of the only dudes in America that knew what it was like to be thrown twice by somebody that knows what they were doing. So the guy was like, yeah, do it to the interpreter. So
I remember seeing some great black and white clip, probably, I mean, obviously not from the 1900s, a bit later, but some woman was being interviewed by someone about, traveling across country, and the journalist asked something about, like, how are you staying safe? How can you stay safe? And she's like, oh, I've learned some jujitsu. And he says, oh, can you show me? And she's like, sure. And she grabs his arm and just yeets this guy into a ditch. He just disappears. It was amazing. And I love this because you talked about where jujitsu has kind of gone to today. And I agree with you that it feels like in a lot of ways it has become kind of more hostile to women. I mean, a lot of people pay lip service to this, to the idea of we want to empower women and get them in here. But it really feels to me, at least in the year 2025, when we're speaking right now, that for a lot of men, they don't want to see women succeed in that manner. And that maybe they pay lip service to it, but at the end of the day, it feels like there's some kind of entrenchment to try to prevent this from happening. I mean, you'll hear so many people talk about how, like, well, a woman can never beat up a man. Well, look, I got to say, I've sparred with some really good women, and yes, they absolutely can. And if you put up a wall to keep them out, it creates a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it is interesting to hear that more than 100 years ago, in many ways, jiu-jitsu was more inclusive back then than it is today.
yeah, and we can let that sort of get us down, or we can let it motivate us, right? Because there's no reason we can't create that space. Like jujitsu was in many ways designed for women. Think about, like, it's interesting to me that the same folks that are the hyper masculinist guys that are like, this is for big, tough, strong people, I think miss the point entirely. Like the whole point of if you can just beat up anybody, you don't need jujitsu. You got nature's jujitsu. But why are we not? And also, if you're the type of person that can get there's two types of people in the world that get bullied. Either they learn that all bullying should be rejected and we should defend folks that are getting bullied, or they learn that it's better to become the bully. And that's a sad state of affairs. I did want to mention too, just briefly, that this wasn't just America. Like Sadakazu Uyenishi, who was known as Raku, was his fight name, moved to England, and there's a really fascinating history in England there. But a huge percentage of the women that were learning jujitsu, judo, there were women, including suffragists. Edith Garrett, who's the famous in some circles as the suffragette who knew jujitsu, created a system of bodyguards for the Pankhurst sisters, who were the most prominent suffragists in England at the time. If you've seen Mary Poppins, and if you haven't, you should go see the classic Mary Poppins film. There is a song in there that references the Pankhursts. So in that way, it's called Sister Suffragette. And in that way, Mary Poppins has a jujitsu connection.
Interesting. I want to ask you something here. So when I started jiu-jitsu, a big part of the marketing that I was exposed to about, as to why you should train this sport was that jiu-jitsu is the legitimate martial art. And there was a lot of slander against the other martial arts, karate, taekwondo, Japanese jiu-jitsu especially. These are TMAs, traditional martial arts, and they're just not legitimate. They don't work. And you should train jiu-jitsu because it does work. There is a degree of truth to that, at least if you look at the modern day, because there has been kind of like a strip mallification of a lot of the, I guess, more traditional martial arts. But I realized at some point that I was being deceived to a degree, right? I mean, yes, there are a lot of kind of soft styles of martial arts that don't necessarily work. But man, let me tell you, I know some guys who are really good at Kyokushin karate, and they could beat the crap out of me if they wanted to. So it isn't that simple. And this makes me wonder, if we go back in time and we take a look at the way they were training and what they were training in the 1900s, how quote unquote legitimate would we consider that compared to what we train today? I mean, obviously today, I'm sure that the technique is more refined and more effective, but were they training like basically bullshido back then? Clearly not. It worked to some degree, but to what extent would we recognize this as an effective fighting system today? And to what extent do you feel like we've actually evolved and improved upon that?
So the very simple answer to that, and then I'll dive a little bit deeper, is that the Bushido, so the effectiveness varied widely depending on who you were training with and what you were training. But and this I think is kind of his main achievement. The highest quality across the board were Kodokan Judoka. And and that doesn't mean they were the only tough people, because of course you had catch wrestlers that were really tough, boxers that were really tough. I think your example of karate is interesting as well, because people always kind of shit on karate, but Stephen Thompson is pretty tough. Yamashita is pretty tough. And for me, this is a term I stole from Matt Thornton, but it's all about aliveness. If a martial art is trained with resistance, if a martial art is trained with people who are actually trying to stop you, if you're training under realistic conditions, you're going to either develop realistic responses or you're going to quit doing that and do something else. And that's another bit of an oversimplification. But like, scholars talk about martial arts in a way that is interesting, because some of them are for purely for fighting, and some of them are for other things. And I think that's fine. Let a thousand flowers bloom. We just should be clear about why we're doing what we're doing. And so if you want it to be effective, there are certain conditions it has to meet. So I will say that, like, because there were, dozens, maybe hundreds of different schools of jujitsu at the time that were all widely different. Some were undoubtedly very effective, some were undoubtedly less so. And you see that when the challenge matches start happening. The Kodokan Judoka, because they had a regimented curriculum, a training method, and a ton of amazing training partners. Plus, you were kind of getting the best of the best, because the best of the best were the ones that sort of migrated overseas as emissaries of Kodokan Judo. Those were the people that you could be like, okay, definitively, yes, that's good and it works. And so the broader answer, if we're talking about just jujitsu and what was represented as such, there was definitely extremely legitimate stuff. And you see that from the way that challenge matches happened. You see that from the way public demonstrations with people like Ajax Whitman, the cop who wasn't trying to let Katsugo Higashi choke him unconscious. You see the results of that, and that shows that it was working. I do think, and one of the interesting things that we could talk about more is, I don't think that, so people always think about, you know, God, what am I trying to express here? The folks that are against inclusion in martial arts always try to say, well, if you let in women, gay people, non-binary people, whatever, whoever they're trying to shit on, these people are always like, well, if you let them in, it's going to water it down. It's going to get soft. I don't think that's true at all. I think it's the opposite of true. What I think is,
I think it's provably the opposite of true.
Yeah,
I mean, I think if you look at, yeah, and maybe we can talk about that as we tie this up in a bit, but continue your thought.
For sure. But like, that's the thing. That's the rhetoric, right? That's their rhetorical goals, is you let them in, it just gets soft. I think that's the opposite of true. But what I think is true, and I don't think this is all bad, as things get as more mass appeal comes to it, you're not going to have as hard a core, right? Because if the only people you market to, the only people that you bring into an art are tough, fighty guys that don't mind occasionally get their elbow popped or go unconscious, you're going to have a core of very tough people. And the broader you market, the more people that are like, hey, I don't want to just do MMA every night. And here's the thing, I don't think that's bad. It's just, but things are, you have to recognize that it has benefits, and it has that, and it has some drawbacks, I'm sure. But like, as money starts to get involved with things, and that I think is the real determining factor, if you have a financial incentive to, change the way that you do things, that's gonna lead to certain changes. Um, the So I kind of got off track there. I just thought that was an important point to make.
Well, I can pick up and run with that too. I mean, I've talked about this on BJJ Mental Models, right? There is often this idea that if you want to build a great competition team, you got to turn it into a meat grinder. And that way you weed out the weak, right? But the problem that happens there is you create the survivorship bias where the people who are left over, yeah, they're the survivors. So they're probably going to, they're the ones who went on to win competition. Everyone else, just through attrition, they left because they weren't getting value out of this experience. That doesn't mean that what you're doing is right, though. That's survivorship bias, right? You've created a situation where you've weeded out people so that whoever is left over, by definition, they survived. And that makes it really easy for them to spin the story about how it's important to build these meat grinder gyms. But again, if you look at the trajectory of jiu-jitsu in just the last 20 years, as it's opened up and become more popular, and women's jiu-jitsu has just exploded in popularity, you've got a lot more hobbyists training it. I think you can provably say that the quality of jiu-jitsu has gotten exponentially better in the last 20 years. And that is because the pie has gotten bigger. It's not because we trained tougher. It's because we opened up the door to the hobbyists and the out of shape people and the people who are afraid to fight. And what happens then is those people bring in their friends, and their friends bring in their kids, and their kids grow up in jiu-jitsu. And 1 out of 1,000 of those people is going to become the next Fiona Davis, right? That's how you get great athletes and high caliber athletes. It's a game of numbers. You cannot create a Gordon Ryan, right? You cannot just take like a random person and just put them through a meat grinder and Gordon Ryan comes out the other side. You find people like that by opening the door to everyone, making jiu-jitsu a fun place where people don't want to leave. And through the law of large numbers, you will find greatness within them, right? And I think that the growth of the sport and the quality of the training proves my point here.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfectly said. And honestly, I think that's a thing where there's almost a hipsterism in jiu-jitsu where people want to be like,
Almost.
yeah, okay, touche, right? I mean, I get it. People found a thing that they loved and it was niche and they were into it before it was cool. And that's great. And you get some, credibility points for that. But here's the thing. If we really do love this, shouldn't we want to share it as widely as possible? And if we really do believe what we say about the benefits of jiu-jitsu, shouldn't we want people to get those benefits? And if we really mean what we say about jiu-jitsu being an effective martial art, that the strong can use, or that the weak can use to defeat the strong, and that technique will conquer brute force. If we really believe that, shouldn't we be marketing to those folks and bringing more of those folks in? I certainly think so. And it's interesting to see that in studying this period, 1900 to 1906, it's really interesting to see that a lot of the things that we talked about over the course of this past hour are still issues in jiu-jitsu today. And so for me, a friend of mine messaged me after one of the last Fighting Matters where he was like, hey, is it true what the right says about the left? Is it true what the left says about the right? And I'm like, man, I'm not going to get into totalities and like broad generalizations. But I think that if we focus on values and like actually using this martial art to benefit other people, and if we focus on critical thinking skills of like, hey, there are these claims that letting folks in has watered down the art. It's not as good as it used to be. Can't we use our critical thinking skills to look at the Ruotolo twins? Can't we use our critical thinking skills to look at Fion or Adele Fornerino or Maisa Bastos, any one of these, and think like, wow, look at where the art has gone, because more minds and more bright minds, more diligent people that love jiu-jitsu are in the art than ever. And so it's interesting to me too to look back on. I made the case earlier that arguably jiu-jitsu was more popular in 1905 as a relative to the population than it is today. The thing is, though, we have more resources today. We have more people. We have more human capital. We have more capital generally. And, there's no reason that jiu-jitsu can't reach the highest heights that we can imagine.
Well said, sir. Well, the last thing I want to ask you here to maybe tie this all up, we've talked about the importance of inclusion and growing the sport. What other lessons can we pull from history here, from what you found? What are the other things that we've seen as patterns, which maybe we can derive knowledge from that, and we should change the way that we train today based on what's worked in the past?
investing in people pays off, number one, that the $5,000 you spend today on that amazing instructor is going to pay immeasurable dividends in the future, that you cannot create a thing that you love without investing in that thing, investing your time, investing your resources. And if you live in a country, which most of us do, investing that country's capital into that like public investments always pay off. And public investments, particularly in a thing we love like martial arts, pay off as well. Second, xenophobia is always bad. Imagine if Theodore Roosevelt had been hostile to the Asian martial arts instead of like open to learning not just one, but two, and incorporating that and being very public in his advocacy about that. No one of us is as smart as all of us. No one country, no one culture, no one person has all the answers. And so this is why xenophobia is always counterproductive. Third, we should have an abundance mentality. And I think this applies in so many different aspects of life. One of the things Roosevelt did was he broke down a bunch of monopolies. Railroad trusts were using their monopoly power to gouge consumers and stop people from being able to make a decent living at their jobs and have purchasing power to buy homes. And he implemented a series of social reforms that I think really mirror his interest in other aspects of his life, advocacy for working people, the human in the arena again, right? And so I think that those lessons, that the people that work hard should have a chance to get ahead, that we should invest in each other as human beings, and that we should listen, not just not be xenophobic, but be open to insights from other cultures, insights from other nationalities, races, ethnicities, genders. And we should constantly be trying to grow. A growth mentality and an abundance mentality is how you get good at martial arts, and it's how you get good at everything else.
Well said, as always, man. Well, you've alluded many times that you've got work that you're publishing on this front. You've also got places on the internet where you're posting more information here. If people want to find that, how can they do it?
If you are on TikTok or Instagram, I'm on TikTok and Instagram at Jeff Shaw BJJ. I have a couple of other Instagram accounts too, but those are the ones where I post all the history content and the history videos. I also have a 6-hour jiu-jitsu history series video on our YouTube channel, so you can check that out if you want. But I'm really excited about the academic work that I'm publishing over the next year. I'm publishing 4 different papers about this period, about Roosevelt, about the use of political cartoons in spreading jiu-jitsu, about gender in jiu-jitsu, and about what we call identity formation, which is how you use your rhetoric, your affect, the way you are in the world in order to formulate your identity, right? Because we're not just one thing. You are a jiu-jitsu guy, but you're not just a jiu-jitsu guy. You are a Canadian, but you're not just a Canadian. And for those of us for whom jiu-jitsu is a huge part of our lives, that plays a role in forming our identity. And so I'm really interested in exploring like how people identify as martial artists, how people use the martial arts in creating the identities that we all have. So if you're interested in following along, the stuff on Instagram and TikTok, Jeff Shaw BJJ, is very much for a general audience. I always post the academic papers as well for the people that are more interested. But and I'm always happy to make book recommendations for folks too.
Amazing, man. Well, I will put your contact info in the show notes if I can figure out a smart way to do that. But I definitely recommend if people want to get in touch with you to ask you questions, learn more about this, or if they want to just keep up to date on when your next publications are coming out, I definitely recommend and suggest following Jeff, not just because of this info, but because Jeff is one of the just legit good guys in the sport. So thanks a lot, Jeff, for doing this, man. I think this is a blast. Any closing thoughts or things you wanted to cover that we didn't talk about in this one?
No, I just want to say I appreciate everybody listening.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks to the listeners, too. We'll talk to you in the next one. See you then.
Thanks, all.